Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Score Study video series for the 4 Minutes from Midnight virtual band project. Again, I'm Yoshio Yamashita. I am the director for the virtual band, and I'm also the composer of the symphony 4 Minutes from Midnight. This video is going to be covering the saxophone parts for the symphony, specifically alto saxophones 1 and 2, and the tenor saxophone part. The bari sax part is included in the score study video previous to this, which is labeled low reeds. Let's begin by looking at rehearsal letter A in part 1. Tenor sax, you're playing with the low reeds and the low brass right there. You're playing the Dies Irae plain chant, which I discuss at more length in score study video number 3, which addresses some of the principal themes found in the symphony. I do suggest you check that video out as well. Alto saxophones obviously check that video out as well because it is important to understand the overall context of what you're playing, not just your individual part. Alto saxophone 1, be careful with your accidentals in these runs. Accidentals do carry all the way through every measure as written. Alto saxophone 2, make sure that we're not rushing through these triplets, subdivide and count them out. Make sure there's a significant difference between the forte and fortissimo, first and second altos, and then tenor saxophone, that there's a difference between fortissimo and accented forte. And the same goes for these 3 measures leading up to rehearsal letter B. Alto 1, again, just subdivide and play these very cleanly. Practice slowly with the metronome at first, and then work them up to tempo. They're probably not as fast as your fingers want to make them, so practicing with a metronome and practicing slowly and conscientiously at first is to your advantage. Same thing goes here with Alto 2. Alto 2, again, mind those accidentals. They carry all the way through the measure. Alto 1 and 2 join the remainder of the woodwinds on the clarinets, the oboes, and the flutes. Here, leading up to rehearsal letter C, tenor sax, you join the low reeds and the brass in this giant crunch chord there. And there's a clean cutoff at letter C, meaning there is no downbeat, and there should be no sound bleed over from the measure preceding. Tenor sax, you have that part with the low brass and the low reeds. Alto saxophones, here you're playing in a woodwind choir at letter D, 5 bars after letter D, more correctly. And this is a chorale style phrase, very nice, very legato, singingly, but piano, because you are playing with a whole bunch of other people at that point. You're playing with the flutes, the oboes, and the piccolo. I'm going to skip this rest. Do make sure that you count these rests correctly. 5, 4, 2, 4 for the tenor sax. And then there is a pulse change from the quarter note pulse to a half note pulse in the cut time. And then there's another pulse change from the half note pulse to a quarter note pulse at letter F. Alto 1, again, very legato, very smooth here in this last phrase leading up to letter G. Then at letter G, at some point in letter G, all 3 parts, alto 1, 2, and tenor sax, will have a 5-lit or a quintuplet figure. While they're different, tenor saxophone, you have this kind of 3 up, 2 up figure, and then alto 1 and 2, you have this figure that's a little bit different from tenor sax. Even though they're a little bit different, they all need to be addressed in the same way, in that the primary mistake people make with odd-numbered tuplets, 5s, 7s, and 9s, and I suppose if we're being pedantic, 11s and 13s, but you don't see those quite as often, is that they don't subdivide correctly. We're taught to subdivide 8th notes, 16th notes, triplets, and sextuplets generally somewhere between middle school and high school, or maybe even college, depending on when you learn that. No judgment here. However, A lot of the time when we see a 5-lit or a 7-lit or a 9-lit, we just start at the beginning note and play through it and hope we land on the next beat or the next subdivision successfully, and that usually doesn't work. So the solution to playing these tuplets in time is finding a word that you can subdivide with for these 5-lits or quintuplets. Some suggestions might be the words university or geophysical, or find another word that works for you and simply count it out like you would 1 E and a 2 E and a for 16th notes, or 1 and 2 and for 8th notes. And again, practice slowly with a metronome to make sure you're in time and in tempo, and then work it up to speed. At letter H, make sure you're counting your rest very carefully. There's a meter change every bar. One of the things I do when I have trouble counting out meter changes is simply write 3, 4, 6, so on and so forth above every measure. All of this is rest. At letter K, alto 1 and 2, please make sure you're differentiating these triplet figures from a dotted 8th 16th. So you should be subdividing 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 triplet 1 E and a 2 E and a so on and so forth. So make sure that you're doing that, because the triplet figure is distinctly different from the dotted 8th 16th. And it's your job to make sure that you play it like that. Letter L, I discuss at more length thematically in score study video number 4. Here, Alto Sax 1, you're playing a counter melody to the theme that's going on. If you're interested in that theme, please reference score study video number 4, themes part 2. At letter M, you'll notice there's no crescendo leading into it from the bar before. That's because that's an orchestrated crescendo, meaning that more instruments begin playing as we get closer to rehearsal letter M. Therefore, we don't necessarily have to write a crescendo in every single part. Now we see an orchestrated decrescendo as the phrase here at M goes on. Alto saxophone 2, you'll see you drop out 4 bars before the end of the 8-bar phrase. And alto saxophone 1, you'll see you're dropping in pitch and tessitura there. Tenor saxophone, you see you're seeing longer notes, so you're playing fewer notes in that space. So you're seeing a decrescendo because there are fewer notes being played by fewer instruments as we get closer to letter N. Letter N is a beautiful horn chorale, which restates the theme we hear at letter L. Letter O is again another restatement of that chorale, but in a different key. And then letter P is kind of the grand finale of the second movement, in which we see that theme, which I also discuss at great length in score study number 4. We see that come back in kind of the grandest presentation. Alto Sax 1, you do have the melody there. Alto Sax 2, you have a counter melody. Pay special attention, both alto 2 and tenor, to these tied notes and make sure you lean on them. Most of them are suspensions and releases. For instance, this one in the second bar of P. Let's listen to that real quickly. So what you can hear is we're creating these purposeful dissonances that resolve to consonances, and the mechanics that make that work are in the alto 2 part. So make sure just to lean on those and emphasize them just a little bit. Letter Q is a euphonium solo, where the altos and tenor have rest. Letter R is a flute solo. So everything between letter R and S is an accompaniment figure. Even though you have some beautiful melodic writing here, it's important that you stay beneath the flutes and actually where you come in, the clarinets as well. We'll look at that in context in just a second. But when you have pianissimo written on your part, that means truly pianissimo, not piano, not piano pianissimo, but truly pianissimo, very quiet, so as not to cover up the soloist. So let's look at that in context here, a few bars after letter R. I'm going to start 3 bars before the 3/4 bar. So as you can see on that particular realization of the piece, your parts are very quiet, almost inaudible, I suppose, but they are there. We need to hear them, but they need to be beneath that principal melody that the flute and clarinets have right there. Letter S is a recapitulation of that theme, except it's orchestrated in the full band. Alto 2 and tenor, you have offbeats, which you're trading with the trombones and the first bassoon. So if you'll look at the full score, if you look at bassoon 1 has downbeats on 2, 3, and 4. You, as well as the third clarinets, have every offbeat, so every and then bassoons and first and second trombones down here have downbeats. So you're trading eighth notes in kind of a motor type of fashion. First alto sax, you have what's called a descant line, which you have doubled in the euphoniums. Or no, not the euphoniums, but the first and third horns and the first and second oboes. So be listening for that when you play and record your part. You'll notice that there are some secondary slurs under large slurs. What should be observed there is the larger slur as a phrase marking, and then the smaller slurs as actual slurs. Obviously, you can slur within the larger slur, so on and so forth. This is a tie, not a slur. At the poco retard, there will be a slowdown. Watch the conductor video for that. And then the odd tempo is simply a second recap of what happens at letter S at the beginning of letter S. Tenor sax, you have the same thing. Alto 1 and alto 2, you now have the melody. Now, one thing I want you to think about while you're playing this is if you try to break this into 4-measure phrases like so, you're going to end up breaking this tie right here and the larger slur here. So what you should be thinking about is a larger 8-measure phrase or kind of a sentence here in which you have a larger 8-bar phrase instead of 2 smaller 4-bar phrases. That's the end of the brief analysis for part 1. If you're going to watch this video in 2 parts, you can pause here and resume when you're ready. Otherwise, let's continue to part 2. As you may notice, I'm not doing a whole lot of reference or playing off of the full score or the condensed score. That's to save time so these videos aren't 45 minutes long instead of about 25 minutes long. If you are interested in examining your part with the score to a greater extent, I highly suggest you watch the condensed score video for the piece, which is also on this YouTube channel. The beauty of the condensed score is you're able to see which instruments your part doubles or is playing with at any particular moment, or if your instrument is the only part playing a particular line. Again, that video is available on the YouTube channel as well. Let's begin at looking at the opening to part 2. Again, watch your accidentals and practice these runs slowly. The accidentals do carry all the way through the measure, and these runs are probably not as fast as your fingers want to make them. This opening section is made up of three principal elements: runs, trills, and fanfare type figures. Runs, obviously, the 16th notes, trills, and then the fanfare type figures would be primarily these dotted 8th, 16th figures, especially at letter A. Fanfare type figures should be played marcato at all times and accented, even though they don't have true accents written on them. Trills should be fast trills and also carry through ties. So second alto, the trill carries through the tie onto this dotted 8th note. Tenor sax and first alto, the sforzando, attack the sforzando, do not decrescendo, and hit this mezzo forte, so sforzando and subito mezzo forte. There is no decrescendo down the run. That whole run should be attacked. Letter B is the beginning of the mixed meter chorale that's been popping up throughout the piece previous. I discussed this theme at length in score study number 4, so if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about how I orchestrated around this movement, go ahead and check that out, also on the YouTube channel. The alto saxophone entrance here on Alto 1 is much like the entrance around letter D in part 1. Again, very legato, very plaintive, and just very smooth mezzo piano, not too loud, but not overly soft either. Letter C is essentially a recap of what happens at letter B, except it's transposed up a half step. It is in concert E flat minor, which for altos is concert C minor, and for tenor sax is in your F minor. Altos, that's in your C minor. As with most pieces of music, the phrasing you hear from the phrases before you notice you have a 3-4-4-4-6-4 phrase here, meaning that the 3-4-4-4-6-4 preceding is also a phrase. Phrase this melodic content like the way it was phrased before. And again, this is legato, smooth, plaintive, not overly loud or forceful. 2, follow suit from Alto 1. Alto 1, this phrase before letter E, should decrescendo to a true pianissimo, meaning practically no sound there. We want a fade out and then a fade back in as described by the decrescendo and then the crescendo back up. Alto 1 and 2, you'll notice this is very similar to the figure you had or the melody you had at the a tempo after letter S in part 1. That's because it is the same theme. However, it's transposed. The theme at letter S in part 1 was in your A minor, concert C minor. This is in concert F minor or your D minor. Tenor sax, you have a descant line right there, which is doubled in the bass clarinet, in the French horns, the first and third horns to be precise, and the euphonium. Make sure you're decrescendoing here. Altos, notice you cut off a beat earlier than the tenor saxophone. That is intentional. Make sure your decrescendo lasts as long as your note does. Don't cut the note off early simply because there's a decrescendo. At letter F, you'll hear the chorale that was at letter B and letter C. Again, transposed, but play as before. In the bar before letter G, there is a piccolo solo. As you'll see here, piccolo solo in the bar before G. At letter G, the 2/4 bar, there will be a timpani hit on the downbeat. And then if you watch the conductor video, I will cue in the 4/4 bar, the second bar of G. That isn't so much of a concern to you as you've got rest there, but be aware that that's where you need to start counting this 10 bars of rest. This is a chorale theme that I discuss extensively in score study video number 3, themes part 1. It's actually the hymn theme that becomes the kind of grand finale at the very end of the symphony. So again, if you're interested in that, reference score study video number 3. Letter H is a copy and paste of the beginning of the symphony. It's a direct recapitulation, so I'm going to skip through that as all of the same warnings apply. Again, the sforzando, and then subito mezzo forte, accidentals carry all the way through the measure, so on and so forth. Letter K is a brass chorale, as is letter L, which is simply a continuation of the brass chorale. Alto 1, make sure these are staccato, and then the half note is legato or long, tenuto. The bar before M, watch the conductor video and also listen to the click track which accompanies. For the retard, Alto 2, it is not printed very well here, but make sure to decrescendo from fortissimo to forte by beat 4. Again, trills are fast trills here. Alto 1, this bring out refers to the tied quarter note and then the 2 measures following, not the triplets and trills following that rest. All 3 sax parts, the sextuplet runs are likely slower than you think they are or your fingers want to make them. So practice slowly with a metronome. Notice that the final note of the sextuplet is tied. These triplet figures, make sure that the trills last through the tie and that they are fast trills. Same thing here. Make sure we're in tune. Make sure we're counting and subdividing these runs. And first alto, make sure we're subdividing these triplets as well. Second alto, I believe I've assigned divisi parts here at letter N. Be mindful of that. First alto, this is a fanfare figure that you have with, I believe it's the first flute and the first clarinet, which is then echoed in the oboes and the piccolo. And then you have this fanfare figure, which I talk about a little bit in score study number 3. You have that fanfare figure with the second flutes and the second oboe and the second clarinet. Notice that these descending triplet figures are simply chromatic scales. First alto, mezzo piano decrescendo to a true pianissimo. Don't be thrown off by the fact that second alto and tenor have a sforzando. Their second alto and tenor make that a true sforzando, not just an accent. And then, of course, decrescendo down to piano. Letter O is a gorgeous sounding horn chorale, which will do a little poco ritardando in the 5/4 bar, and then a tempo, I believe, in the 4/4 bars following. Letter P is a brass chorale, which is the same brass chorale that is played at letter Q, which is, again, the grand finale of the entire symphony. You're seeing some figures here that look very similar to the runs, trills, and fanfare figures that you saw at letter M. So we're going to play them and phrase them the same way. Notice that the ends of these sextuplets are tied. These trills carry through the ties. Tenor saxophone, you're playing more closely with the low brass and the trombones at this point. So be listening for those rather than the alto saxophones. Alto 2, make sure you differentiate between the sextuplet here and the quintuplet or fivelet here. Alto 1, notice this triplet on beat 4 in bar 168 does not return to the same note. It's G, E, B, or G sharp, excuse me, E, B, instead of G sharp, E, G sharp, like the pattern preceding and in most of the other preceding triplets. Alto 1, make sure we're subdividing and practicing these sevens slowly. They are just scale patterns, but make sure that we're playing those in time, especially now that we have triplets attached to them. Alto 2, you have the melody here, actually. And then tenor saxophone and first alto, make sure we're subdividing and playing the 6 and then the 7 in time. They are not metrically equivalent to each other. One has 6 notes in the beat and one has 7 notes to the beat, which are slightly different. Alto 2, you continue to have the melody through the 2/4 bar. Tenor saxophone, you join back with alto 2, 2 bars before the 2/4. Alto 1, this is a fast trill, but break it off and take a breath before the 4/4 bar. And then, of course, you have this nice A major chord for the alto saxophones or a D major chord for the tenor saxophone, leading to a fortissimo chord at the very end. Make sure that we are crescendoing from forte or fortissimo to fortissimo. That is 3 Fs. And make sure that that last 8th note is legato. It's not a stinger on a Sousa march. It is an 8th note that we are holding out for its full duration. And that concludes the analysis of part 2 for this video. This has been an analysis and just a brief overview of the alto sax 1 and 2 and tenor sax parts for the symphony. I hope this video has been informational and helpful as you prepare your parts for video recording. If you have questions or comments about this video, you can email us at 4minutesvirtual@gmail.com. If you have other spots that you'd like to see us address in a future score study video, you can also email those to 4minutesvirtual@gmail.com. And thanks for watching.